Discipline was still expected. No one announced its end, and no rule was officially removed. Yet something was missing. Men knew how they were supposed to behave, how they had always behaved, but no one corrected them when they didn't. Expectations lingered without pressure, and standards existed without consequence. What unsettled them was not the loss of discipline itself, but the realization that it was still assumed, even as no one enforced it anymore. For most of their captivity, discipline had been unmistakable. It lived in posture, timing, and repetition. Even before a guard spoke, the men knew how to stand, when to move, and what was expected of them. Discipline did not need to be explained. It had been absorbed long before capture, reinforced by routine, and maintained through consequence. Inside the camp, it continued almost automatically. When enforcement began to fade, the expectation of discipline did not disappear with it. The men still understood what correct behavior looked like. They still recognized the standards they were meant to meet. What changed was not knowledge, but response. Actions that once produced immediate correction now passed without comment. Discipline remained assumed, but it no longer arrived with follow-through. At first, this gap felt temporary. The men continued to behave as before, anticipating that enforcement would return. Lines were formed with care. Tasks were completed precisely. Movements remained measured. Discipline persisted through habit rather than pressure. Yet with each day that passed without consequence, that habit was tested. Small lapses appeared without intention. A posture relaxed slightly. A routine was shortened. A rule was followed loosely rather than exactly. Each lapse carried a familiar expectation of response, but the response never came. The absence was unsettling. Discipline without consequence felt incomplete, like a sentence left unfinished. This created a quiet contradiction. The men were still expected to maintain standards, yet nothing confirmed whether those standards mattered anymore. Discipline had once functioned as a dialogue between behavior and authority. An action was taken, and a reaction followed. Without that reaction, the dialogue collapsed. Discipline became a one-sided performance. Emotionally, this was not freeing. It introduced doubt. Without enforcement, the men no longer knew how much effort was required or why it was required at all. Over-discipline felt wasteful. Under-discipline felt risky. Each man navigated this uncertainty privately, adjusting behavior without guidance. The guards, still present but distant, reinforced the ambiguity. Their silence did not clarify expectations. It simply left them implied. Discipline was still assumed, but no longer demonstrated through action. This distance made authority feel abstract rather than immediate. The men were no longer responding to control. They were responding to memory. Over time, memory proved weaker than consequence. Discipline rooted in habit can endure for a while, but without reinforcement, it begins to soften. The men still knew what was expected, but knowing did not compel action in the same way. Effort became selective. Precision became conditional. Discipline shifted from obligation to option. Socially, this change went largely unspoken. No one announced that discipline was fading. No one encouraged its abandonment. The men observed one another quietly, noting how far standards could bend without consequence. Each small adjustment became a reference point for others. Discipline was no longer enforced collectively. It was interpreted individually. This individual interpretation weakened the shared experience that discipline once provided. When everyone followed the same standards, behavior felt coordinated and predictable. As enforcement faded, predictability declined. Discipline existed unevenly, stronger in some men than others, guided by personal thresholds rather than shared pressure. By the end of this phase, discipline had not vanished. It had changed character. It no longer functioned as a rule upheld by authority. It functioned as an expectation carried without support. The men still knew what discipline looked like, but they no longer felt compelled to embody it fully. What remained was a hollow version of order. Discipline existed as an idea rather than a force. It was remembered, assumed, and referenced internally, but rarely confirmed externally. And in that gap between expectation and enforcement, the men began to experience a new kind of uncertainty, one that would shape everything that followed as discipline continued to exist without anyone insisting upon it. Many people who enjoy these stories watch on television. Subscribing helps make sure the next story appears automatically. As the days passed without enforcement, discipline began to feel less like a rule and more like a question. The men still carried the standards inside them, but those standards no longer matched the reality around them. In the past, correctness had been confirmed. A mistake produced correction. A lapse produced consequence. Now correctness existed without verification, and that made it unstable. At first, many men tried to keep the old standards intact through sheer routine. They stood straight because they had always stood straight. They moved quickly because delay had once invited scrutiny. They arranged their spaces carefully because disorder had once been noticed. These actions were not performed for guards anymore. They were performed for memory, for habit, for the reassurance that structure still existed. But memory is not a substitute for feedback. Without response, effort begins to feel arbitrary. The men started to ask themselves, quietly and repeatedly, how much discipline was still required. Was posture still important if no one looked? Did timing still matter if no one corrected lateness? If standards were still expected, why did they feel invisible? This uncertainty created a new kind of strain. Strict discipline demanded energy, and energy was limited. To maintain high standards without reinforcement began to feel costly. Yet abandoning standards felt risky because the expectation still lingered. The men found themselves caught between two pressures: the pressure to conserve themselves and the pressure to remain aligned with an order that might return at any time. As a result, discipline became selective. Men chose where to preserve standards and where to relax them. Some maintained outward discipline during visible routines, roll calls, work lines, movements through open areas. In private spaces, standards softened. Posture relaxed. Silence thickened. Small shortcuts appeared. This split created a subtle division between what was displayed and what was lived. The guards' behavior reinforced this division. Their presence was irregular and their attention inconsistent. Occasionally, a minor correction would appear, not enough to restore full discipline, but enough to keep uncertainty alive. That inconsistency was more destabilizing than strictness because it prevented adaptation from settling into a stable new pattern. The men could not fully relax, yet they could not justify full precision either. This produced a quiet internal monitoring. Men watched themselves more than they watched the guards. They scanned their own behavior for signs of decline, then corrected, then relaxed again. Discipline was no longer an external system. It became an internal negotiation, repeated many times each day. Over time, that negotiation grew tiring. Social dynamics shifted as well. Men began to notice differences in how others carried themselves. One man remained rigid, moving as if enforcement still existed. Another moved more freely, conserving energy and avoiding strain. These differences were rarely discussed, but they were observed. In an environment where shared standards once unified behavior, uneven discipline introduced distance. The men did not judge one another harshly. They understood the logic of both responses. Strictness offered control. Looseness offered relief. Yet the coexistence of both made the environment feel uncertain. Without a common standard, No one could be sure what discipline was truly expected anymore. As this uncertainty deepened, discipline began to lose emotional meaning. It no longer represented strength or survival. It became a burden that had to be managed. The men followed standards not because they believed in them, but because they feared the consequences of being wrong, even if those consequences remained unclear. Discipline shifted from confidence to caution. By the end of this phase, the camp still appeared orderly from a distance. Lines formed, routines held, and tasks were completed. Yet beneath that surface, discipline had become unstable. Standards existed, but they were no longer anchored by enforcement. They floated above daily life as expectations without certainty, shaping behavior through doubt rather than clarity. And in that doubt, discipline continued, not as a firm system, but as a fragile habit maintained unevenly and increasingly dependent on each man's willingness to carry it alone. As uncertainty persisted, discipline gradually lost its role as a shared standard. What had once unified behavior across the camp now varied quietly from one man to another. The expectation still existed in theory, but it no longer carried the same meaning for everyone. Without enforcement to align behavior, discipline fractured into personal interpretations. Some men continued to hold themselves to older standards, not because they expected correction, but because discipline had become part of their identity. Precision gave them a sense of control in an environment where little else felt stable. For them, maintaining discipline was a way to preserve self-respect and continuity. It anchored them to a version of themselves that captivity had not yet erased. Others took a different path. They did not reject discipline openly, but they allowed it to soften wherever possible. Movements became less rigid. Timing became approximate. Standards were met only where they seemed necessary to avoid attention. This was not laziness. It was adaptation. Conserving energy became a form of survival when effort no longer produced reassurance. These differences were subtle, but they mattered. When discipline is shared, it creates predictability. When it becomes personal, predictability fades. The men no longer moved in unison, and small variations accumulated. A task finished quickly by one man might be delayed by another. A routine followed strictly by some was treated loosely by others. The camp still functioned, but its internal rhythm grew uneven. Social awareness increased as a result. Men noticed who remained rigid and who had relaxed. Not with judgment, but with attention. These differences introduced quiet distance. Shared discipline had once reduced comparison. Its absence encouraged it. Each man began to measure himself not against rules, but against the behavior of those around him. This comparison created its own tension. Strict discipline began to stand out, drawing unwanted attention even when no one enforced standards. Looser behavior also stood out, carrying the risk of being seen as careless. Without enforcement, there was no safe middle ground. Discipline no longer protected the individual. It exposed him. Over time, many men adjusted toward invisibility. They adopted the most common level of discipline practiced around them, neither too strict nor too relaxed. This convergence was not directed. It emerged naturally as a way to reduce attention and avoid uncertainty. Discipline was no longer about correctness. It was about blending in. This shift altered the meaning of discipline itself. It no longer represented order or strength. It became a social signal, a way to indicate alignment with the group's unspoken norms. The original purpose of discipline, to organize behavior according to clear standards, faded. What remained was a diluted version shaped by caution rather than conviction. Emotionally, this dilution carried weight. Discipline had once offered clarity. It told the men who they were expected to be. Now that clarity was gone, maintaining discipline felt lonely when it was not shared. Relaxing it felt risky when expectations remained implied. The men occupied a space where no choice felt fully correct. By the end of this stage, discipline still existed, but it no longer unified the camp. It had become fragmented, negotiated quietly and unevenly across individuals. The men continued to move, work, and live within the same boundaries, but the shared framework that once held them together had weakened. This fragmentation marked a turning point. When discipline stops being shared, it can no longer sustain itself. Without common enforcement or common belief, it begins to fade not through resistance, but through quiet divergence. And as discipline continued to lose its collective meaning, the camp moved closer to a state where expectations remained, but no longer shaped behavior in any consistent way. As shared discipline weakened, what remained was not order, but appearance. The men continued to behave in ways that resembled discipline, yet the substance beneath those actions had changed. Movements still followed familiar patterns, routines still unfolded in recognizable forms, but the reasons for maintaining them had shifted. Discipline was no longer sustained by belief or enforcement. It was sustained by habit and visibility. In public spaces, behavior remained careful. Lines were formed. Tasks were completed with enough precision to appear correct. These actions were not driven by expectation of punishment, nor by respect for authority. They were driven by the desire to avoid attention. Discipline had become a surface behavior, something displayed rather than lived. This transformation created a subtle split between outer conduct and inner experience. Internally, many men felt detached from the routines they followed. They no longer associated discipline with purpose or meaning. Externally, they continued to perform those routines because stopping entirely felt risky. Discipline became a mask worn to maintain neutrality. The absence of enforcement intensified this effect. Without correction, there was no confirmation that discipline still mattered. Without confirmation, effort felt speculative. The men followed routines not because they expected a response, but because the absence of response made deviation feel uncertain. Performance became safer than sincerity. Over time, this performance grew thinner. Precision declined where it could be hidden. Timing became flexible as long as it did not draw notice. Discipline adjusted to the lowest level that still avoided attention. What remained was not a commitment to standards, but a calculation of visibility. Emotionally, this hollowing had consequences. Performing discipline without believing in it required energy without reward. Fatigue increased, not from physical labor, but from maintaining appearances. The men conserved themselves by minimizing effort wherever possible. Discipline was no longer something that strengthened them. It was something they managed. Social interaction reflected this shift. Men did not speak about discipline because there was nothing left to discuss. Standards were no longer shared or defended. They were assumed loosely and maintained only where necessary. Interaction focused on coordination rather than alignment, on getting through tasks rather than upholding principles. The guards, still distant and inconsistent, did not disrupt this performance. Their occasional presence reinforced the idea that appearances mattered more than substance. As long as the camp looked orderly, deeper disengagement went unnoticed. This confirmed what the men had already sensed. Discipline existed for observation, not for meaning. As days passed, even the performance began to feel routine. The men no longer thought about why they behaved as they did. They simply maintained enough structure to avoid disruption. Discipline no longer demanded attention or belief. It had become automatic, stripped of intention. By this stage, discipline had lost its internal anchor. It survived only as a pattern of behavior, disconnected from conviction and consequence alike. The men were not rebelling. They were not complying. They were performing what remained of an order that no longer insisted on being real. This was a fragile state. Discipline that exists only as performance cannot sustain itself indefinitely. Without belief, enforcement, or shared meaning, it depends entirely on inertia. And inertia, once disrupted, offers no resistance. As the men continued to move through their days performing discipline without inhabiting it, the camp edged closer to a final quiet phase, where even performance would begin to fade. As discipline continued to exist only as performance, it gradually lost even that function. The effort required to maintain appearances no longer felt justified, especially when nothing depended on it. The men did not decide to abandon discipline. They simply stopped investing energy in something that no longer returned anything in response. At first, the change was subtle. Movement slowed further. Precision relaxed in places where it had once been carefully preserved. Timing became flexible, not strategically, but naturally. Discipline did not collapse in a single moment. It thinned, piece by piece, as the need to maintain it quietly disappeared. Without enforcement, without belief, and without shared meaning, discipline had no anchor left. It no longer protected the men from punishment, because punishment rarely came. It no longer preserved identity, because identity had already softened. It no longer organized life, because routine had taken over that role. Discipline had become redundant. Emotion reflected this redundancy. The tension once associated with maintaining standards faded completely. There was no sense of relief, only a gentle flattening. The men no longer felt pressure to behave a certain way. They also no longer felt driven to behave differently. The absence of discipline did not create freedom. It created neutrality. Socially, this shift passed without comment. No one announced that discipline had ended. No one reacted when standards slipped further. Behavior adjusted quietly across the camp, settling into a level that required the least effort and produced the least attention. Coordination remained where necessary. Everything else fell away. The guards, still present in form, did not reverse this process. Their expectations remained implied but unspoken. Without enforcement, those expectations carried no weight. Authority existed as memory rather than force. The men were no longer responding to it, nor resisting it. It had become irrelevant to daily experience. Time accelerated this detachment. Days passed without internal markers. Without discipline to structure effort, the men focused only on endurance. Tasks were done because they were unavoidable, not because they were expected to be done well. Precision no longer mattered. Completion did. By this stage, discipline had fully withdrawn from the men's internal world. It no longer shaped decisions, behavior, or self-perception. The men were not disobedient. They were simply indifferent. Discipline had ceased to function as a psychological force. What remained was a quiet continuation of life within boundaries that still existed physically, but no longer governed behavior internally. The camp still operated. Routines still unfolded. Yet the idea of discipline had dissolved into background absence. This was the final stage of the transformation. Discipline had been expected, then performed, then quietly set aside. Not through rebellion or collapse, but through disuse. When something is no longer enforced, no longer believed in, and no longer needed to survive the day, it does not disappear loudly. It fades, and in that fading, the men continued on, not disciplined and not free, but sustained by habit alone, moving through days that no longer asked them to measure themselves against standards that no one insisted upon anymore. In the end, discipline did not end with defiance or collapse. It ended quietly through absence. Expectations remained, written and remembered, but without enforcement, They lost their ability to guide behavior. What was once demanded became optional, and what was optional slowly became irrelevant. The men did not feel released from discipline, nor did they feel bound by it. They existed in a narrowed space where effort was measured carefully and energy was conserved. Discipline no longer offered clarity or protection. It asked for something without offering anything in return. Life inside the camp continued without disruption. Routines remained. Structures stood. Days passed in steady repetition. Yet beneath that surface order, discipline had withdrawn from the men's internal world, leaving behind only habit and endurance. And so the story ends without a dramatic moment. Not because discipline failed, but because it no longer needed to be obeyed, enforced, or even noticed in a place where expectations remained, but no one insisted on them anymore. Thank you for spending this time here. If these quiet, true World War II stories matter to you, subscribing helps this channel continue.